Hey nerdy knitters, in today's video we're looking at Fisherman's rib in the round. This is what it looks like. It uses a combination of knits and purls, and knit one below and purl one below to get this really plush, thick texture. And don't forget to download your copy of the pattern. I'll have a link for it down below. So I'll also demonstrate how to work this on magic loop. So if you've been curious about how that works, you'll learn in today's video. This is Fisherman's rib knit in the round. You can see it's got a nice plush texture. The combination of knit one and purl one below gives us this thickness. It's reversible, so you could use it for the cuff of a hat or something if you really want a nice thick winter hat. You can see when you look closer, it looks very similar to brioche. By the way it's worked, the knit one below and purl one below produces the same sort of effect that brioche does, without the work of wrapping the stitches and slipping them. Instead, you work a knit one below and purl one below. So let's get started making this fabric. To work Fisherman's rib in the round, you'll need your yarn, a long circular needle because we're using the magic loop method today, and the pattern, which you can find at the link down below in the description box. So let's start by casting on. I'm going to use the long tail cast on today. There, I have my stitches cast on. So for magic loop, you need to take your stitches and divide them in half along the cord. There's half. So I'll pull the excess cord right through. Now I've got each half just like that. Put them up on their needles. The working yarn is on the back needle right here, and to join in the round we'll want those stitches in the front. So working yarn is back there, these stitches are here. Okay, make sure you don't grab the tail, get the tail out of the way, and the tail is a good marker for the beginning of your round, so we don't need to use a marker for that. So I pull the back needle right through. That's where we have this excess cord. Okay, there's my yarn. I need to get that needle underneath, get that tail up, or not the tail, get the working yarn up there. I prefer to hold the yarn in my left hand, but whichever hand you use is perfectly fine. So we've pulled that through. There's the stitches, half the stitches here, and we're going to join them. There's the first one right there. So we join that to the back, and we're going to knit across the first row. Fisherman's rib requires a setup row that we knit across. So I'll knit across this first half of the stitches. You can see why you need a long cord. I've got excess cord on both sides here. But this is nice for working smaller circumferences when you don't have shorter circular needles. Okay, I've finished this first half of the stitches. So I use my cord and I pull that there. I can turn my work. Working yarn is on the back needle. Put these stitches up on the needle because I'm going to work them next. So working yarn is back there. I take that back needle, pull it right through, and I'm going to use that to work these front stitches. Knitting across. This is our setup row. And it's quite common to get a ladder on these turns. So you can work that first stitch or two a little bit tighter just to reduce the likelihood of ladders. There. So we finished our setup row. We come back around to the front, bring our needles back into position. Needle with the working yarn is in behind. Okay, so let's look at the pattern. As long as you cast on an even number of stitches, you'll be fine with this. Our first row we have to knit because Fisherman's rib uses knit ones below and purl ones below to create the texture, and you can't knit or purl below if there's no stitches to knit or purl. So we started with that setup row, just knitting across. That gives us something to work with. And then after that, it's simply a 2-row repeat. Our first row are even rows. We knit one below, purl one, and repeat that across the row. And then our second row, those knit one belows, now we knit them. And those stitches that were purled, we purl them below, and we repeat that across the row. Knit one, purl one below. And that's it. That's the whole repeat. If you prefer written instructions, those are right here. Our setup round, we knit one below, purl one, repeat to the end of the round. And round 2 is knit one, purl one below, repeat to the end of the round. Those knit ones and purl ones below create that texture that you'll see as we'll see it develop in this pattern. All right, so we're back in position for magic loop. Half the stitches in the front, half the stitches in the back. The working yarn is on the back needle. We pull that back needle through. We're ready to work the front stitches. And we start with a knit one below, which can be a bit tricky on this very first stitch, but we're not knitting the stitch that's on the needle, looking for the stitch underneath and inserting right in the middle of that stitch. Bringing our yarn through to knit, and we're dropping this stitch that's on the needle right off. And it creates sort of a double stitch right there. It's got a little collar on the back. And then we bring the yarn to the front between the needles and purl the next stitch. And we repeat that. Knit one below, not knitting this stitch. Go to the stitch underneath. Right in the middle, there's our V, that's the stitch. Right into the hole between the legs. Oops, split that stitch there. If you have to, spread it apart. And look, there's the hole between the legs of that stitch. We knit into it and drop the stitch off our needle. Bring the yarn to the front, purl, knit one below, purl, and repeat that across the row. Okay, we've just finished this first half of the row, so we pull that needle up to the stitches, turn our work, get that tail out of the way. Our working yarn's attached to the back needle. The stitches on the front we can push right up onto this needle, pull that back needle through, continue working the pattern across the row. I'll meet you at the end of this row and we'll look at working the next row. There, we're just finishing up our first row. So we pull that needle through, turn our work, and we know we're at the beginning of the round again because there is the tail where we join to work in the round. And this gap will close up as you work more rows. It's pretty common to have that in Magic Loop. So we're back in our starting position. All of our stitches are here. Yarn's attached to the needle in the back. Let's work the next row. And if you like seeing these videos, click like and subscribe down below so you can be notified when the next video is uploaded. All right, now we've worked our knit one below, purl one. Now we're on row 3, which starts with a knit one, purl one below, knit one, purl one below. So that knit one below, now we're just going to knit it, and we can knit it a little bit tighter to close up that gap. Purl one below is worked just like a knit one below. Bring your yarn to the front. We're not purling into this stitch here. We're going to come down to the stitch underneath, insert just like we're going to purl, wrap our yarn, pull it through, and drop the stitch on the needle right off. And that's a purl one below. Knit one, bring the yarn to the front, not here, go down to the stitch underneath, right there, purl one below. If you're having trouble locating that stitch, just look, there's your stitch on your needle. The head of the purl stitch is right underneath, so that's where we want to insert, underneath that head. right there. You can see the head of that stitch. They're not very hard to find. You just have to pay attention and know what your stitches look like. Get a little bit nerdy with your knitting. There's the head of that stitch, purl one below. And that is the whole pattern. You're purling below in those stitches that you purled the previous row. And we're knitting the stitches that we worked the knit one below in the previous row. All right, let's turn our work and finish up this row. There's that purl stitch, purl one below. Oh, there we go. Pull our needle through, being careful not to pull it all the way through the stitches. Turn our work. So we're back in starting position for magic loop. Working yarn is attached to the back needle. Pull our stitches up onto that needle. Okay, I'll finish this row. We'll see how that looks. Okay, so we finished 2 rows. It's hard to tell right now, but this is a very textured rib because we've worked those stitches below. I'm going to work a few more rows and then we can look at this fabric again. I've worked a few more rows of the pattern. Now if you look at it, you can see it's got quite a squishy texture that's pretty thick from all of those knit one belows and purl one belows. But if you look at it, it looks like I've only worked, well, if you counted these stitches, it looks like I've worked 4 rows. I've actually worked 8 rows. So you can see it takes a long time for this fabric to develop length because we are knitting one below every other row. It's taking away those stitches. It's reducing those rows. So you get the texture, but it takes longer to produce the length. It's very similar to brioche. I go into more detail about that in the Fisherman's Rib Knit Flat video. I'll put a link up for that. And you can also learn how to bind off this pattern. But I had one more tip to share. If you're not sure where you left off, I'm halfway down a round. There's my beginning of round right here. But I'm not sure where I left off. There is a way to check. If you look, you know that the knit one belows, it actually puts another head of the stitch or a collar around your stitch. So if I look at my knit stitch right there, I can see it's just one stitch. There's no extra stitch that came off with it. I haven't done that knit one below on here. Then if I look at the purl stitch right here in the front where I can see the heads of the stitch, there's 2 heads right there. So I must have purled one below on that previous row, which means I'm on a knit one below normal purl stitch because I can see there's 2 heads right there. I'm halfway through, so let's turn this around. I knit this stitch and I can see if I look at it from the back of the work, it has 2 heads, that knit stitch. So I just finished a knit one below, purl one. I'm halfway around the round, so I'm turning my work and I have to do another knit one below, purl one. So that's just a quick tip. If you lose your place, look for the heads of the stitches. The ones that have been worked, the knit one or purl one below, will have 2 heads sitting on them. That gives them that extra texture. And if you like to get nerdy with your knitting, click the subscribe button down below.